The air in Rijeka that evening tasted of salt and possibility. The Adriatic stretched wide and silver beneath a sky that glowed in the last blush of the sun, bleeding pink and orange along the horizon before sliding into indigo. The city hummed softly with its usual summer symphony, tourists chattering in a dozen different languages, the distant plucking of guitar strings from a busker near the promenade, the rhythmic lap of waves against the stone edge of the harbor. The streets near the waterfront carried the fragrance of grilled fish, strong coffee, and the faint sweetness of fresh pastries cooling in bakery windows. Petra walked alone down the narrow street that led toward the beach, her sandals clicking lightly against the old cobblestones. She liked to take these evening walks, letting the sea air rinse away the weight of her long days at university. She was 22, a law student with sharp ambition, but also a secret tenderness that she rarely showed. Her professors said she would make a fine lawyer. She had her father's persistence, her mother's careful precision. But sometimes when she stared too long at her thick textbooks, she wondered if there was more to life than arguments and statutes. Her parents had been older when she was born, gray-haired in a world of younger mothers and fathers. They adored her, no doubt, but there was always something unspoken in their eyes when she asked about the past. Once, just weeks ago, she had asked her mother, "Mom, how old were you when you had me?" Her mother's hands had frozen over the dishwater, her eyes avoiding Petra's. "Older than most," she'd replied softly, and then had changed the subject. Petra carried that unanswered question with her, like a stone in her pocket, small but heavy. Tonight, though, she tried not to think about it. The beach drew her with its promise of calm. The twilight breeze tugged at her dark hair, carrying the briny scent of the sea, and she slowed her steps as the cobblestones gave way to sand. The shore glowed pale under the rising moon, and the tide whispered secrets as it crept in and out. It was quieter here than in the city center. A few couples strolled hand in hand, their laughter faint, and some children still darted along the water's edge, chasing one another. But farther down, beyond the reach of the street lamps, the beach grew darker, lonelier, the waves louder. Petra liked that edge of solitude. She thought best when the world grew hushed. She almost missed it. At first, she thought it was nothing more than a pile of discarded clothes left near the shoreline, the kind tourists sometimes abandoned after late swims. The moonlight caught on fabric, fluttering slightly in the breeze. She might have passed by without stopping, but something, an instinct she couldn't name, made her slow down. She squinted, her steps hesitant in the sand. Number, not clothes. Her breath caught as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. It was a body. A woman lying stretched upon the wet sand, the tide reaching for her again and again, spilling salty water across her arms and legs before retreating. Each wave seemed to claim her, as if the sea were unwilling to let her go. Petra froze, heart hammering against her ribs. For one terrible moment, she thought the woman was dead, a drowned stranger washed ashore. The sight was so surreal, so sudden, that Petra's body refused to move. The ocean hissed softly, retreating, advancing, retreating, and still the woman lay unmoving. Then Petra's training, half forgotten from a first aid course at university, shoved through her panic. Her feet moved. She dropped to her knees in the wet sand, cold water soaking the hem of her dress. "Hello? Lady, can you hear me?" Her voice trembled, thin against the rush of the waves. She leaned closer, brushing strands of soaked hair away from the woman's face. She was young, no older than Petra herself, perhaps in her 20s. Her skin was pale under the moon, her lips tinged blue, her clothes clinging as though the sea had tried to swallow her whole. Petra touched her shoulder, shook it gently. "Please, can you hear me?" For a moment, nothing. Petra's chest tightened. She pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck, searching desperately for a pulse. At first she felt nothing but the icy chill of her skin. Then, faint, but there, a fluttering rhythm beneath the surface. She was alive. Relief nearly knocked Petra back. Okay, okay, you're alive. Her own voice was shaky, as if she were reassuring herself. She tried to remember what to do. Airway, breathing, circulation. She tilted the woman's head back carefully, checked her breathing. Shallow, irregular, but present. Petra's hands trembled as she brushed sand and water from the woman's face. Stay with me, please. You're not alone. But the woman gave no answer. Her eyes remained closed, lashes heavy against pale skin, her body limp as the tide lapped once more at her side. Petra felt a surge of panic. She could not carry her alone. She spun around, searching desperately for someone, anyone. Help! Someone, please help! Her voice cracked across the beach, startling a couple walking in the distance. They hesitated, then ran toward her, their silhouettes breaking into the dim light. By the time they reached her, Petra's knees were raw from kneeling in the sand. The couple, tourists by their accents, perhaps German, immediately knelt beside her. She's breathing, Petra explained, words tumbling out too fast. But she's not waking up. We need to get her to the hospital. Together, with clumsy coordination and frantic determination, they lifted the woman's frail body from the sand. Her head lolled against Petra's shoulder, strands of wet hair sticking to Petra's arm. Petra cradled her carefully, whispering words she wasn't sure the woman could hear. Hold on. Please, hold on. They stumbled up the beach, across the promenade, drawing curious glances from passers-by. Someone called for an ambulance. Lights soon flashed in the distance, red and urgent against the night. When the paramedics arrived, Petra barely noticed the stares of the small crowd that had gathered. She stayed close as they laid the woman on a stretcher, attaching wires, checking her vitals. Petra's dress clung wet to her body, her knees smeared with sand, but she didn't care. The woman's face haunted her, the fragility of it, the strange familiarity she couldn't quite explain. At the hospital, Petra followed. She shouldn't have. She was no family, no relative, not even a friend. But when the ambulance doors closed, she climbed into a taxi and whispered, "Follow them." Something inside her refused to let go. Hours later, long after midnight, she sat in the sterile white corridor of Rijeka's hospital. The antiseptic smell burned her nose. Nurses moved briskly past her, and every time a door opened, she jolted, waiting for news. She told herself she should leave. She had exams to study for, her parents would worry, but her legs refused to move. She stared at the floor, the tiles blurring through her exhaustion. Finally, a doctor approached. He spoke in measured tones. The young woman was stable. Exhaustion, dehydration, near drowning. But she would recover. Petra exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Relief swept over her in dizzying waves. She wanted to weep, to laugh, to collapse. Instead, she only nodded, whispering, "Thank you." When the doctor walked away, Petra rose and pressed her hand against the cool glass of the recovery room door. Inside, under the pale hospital lights, the woman lay with an IV in her arm, her chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Petra felt something stir in her chest, something more than relief, more than pity. It was a pull, a thread tying her to this stranger she had found in the tide. She didn't know her name, her story, or why fate had placed her there on the sand that night. But she knew this. She could not walk away, not now. And so she stayed. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear where you're listening from. Don't forget to like, share with someone who would enjoy it too, and subscribe so you never miss the next story. The morning light crept gently through the thin curtains of the hospital window. It softened the sharp whiteness of the room, spilling warmth across the woman's face. Petra had not moved from her chair all night. Her head leaned against the wall, her dark hair tangled, her body stiff from sitting upright for so many hours. She had promised herself she would only stay until the woman was out of danger. Yet each time her eyelids fluttered heavy with exhaustion, she opened them again, afraid that the woman might wake alone, afraid that she might slip away if no one was there to anchor her back. When the woman stirred at last, it was not dramatic. No gasp, no sudden cry. Only the faintest shifting of her hand against the sheets, the slow flutter of her eyelids. Petra sat up at once, her heart leaping. "Hey!" Her voice was soft, trembling with relief. "You're awake." The woman blinked, her gaze unfocused, confused. She turned her head slightly, wincing, her lips parting as though she wanted to speak, but found the effort too heavy. "It's okay," Petra whispered quickly, leaning forward. "You're safe. You're in the hospital. You're going to be fine." The woman's lips moved again. This time a whisper slipped out, broken and raspy. "Where?" "In Rijeka, by the sea. Do you remember?" Her brow furrowed faintly, a shadow of memory passing across her face. Then her eyes closed again, as if retreating from the effort of remembering. Petra reached for her hand almost without thinking, her fingers wrapping around the stranger's cold, delicate ones. "I found you on the beach," she explained quietly. "The tide. It almost took you. But you're here now. You're alive." For a long moment, there was silence except for the steady beep of the monitor. Then the woman's lips parted once more. "Why?" Petra frowned softly, leaning closer. "Why what?" Her eyes flickered open again, and this time there was something in them, a question, a wound too deep for words. She did not finish her sentence. Instead, she turned her head slightly toward Petra, as though anchoring herself to the sound of her voice. Petra gave a reassuring squeeze to her hand. "Don't worry about anything now. Just rest." The woman fell asleep again soon after, but Petra stayed. She stayed through the nurse's visits, through the doctor's brief explanations of recovery, through the dull ache of her own exhaustion. She went home only when her parents called, their voices tight with concern, and even then she returned the next morning, drawn back as if by gravity. Days passed. The woman's strength returned slowly. She began to speak in fragments, then sentences. Her name, she told Petra, was Heather. She had no family nearby, no one to come for her. Petra did not press for details about what had happened the night she was found. The sorrow in Heather's eyes whenever the subject neared was answer enough. Instead, Petra filled the silence with stories of her own life, the chaos of exams, the quirks of her professors, the way her parents fussed over her still, as if she were a child. Heather listened. She always listened, her gaze fixed on Petra as if every word mattered. Sometimes she smiled faintly, and the sight of it made Petra's chest tighten in ways she could not explain. By the second week, Heather was walking again, though unsteady. Petra wheeled her into the small hospital garden one morning, the two of them basking in the sunlight that shimmered through the leaves. "It feels strange," Heather murmured, lifting her face toward the sky. "Like I shouldn't be here." Petra tilted her head. "You are here. That's all that matters." Heather turned her gaze on her, searching. "Why did you stay?" Petra blinked, caught off guard. "Because I couldn't leave you. Not when you had no one else." Heather's eyes softened, glistening with something unshed. "You saved me." Petra shook her head quickly, embarrassed by the weight of those words. The doctors saved you. The couple on the beach helped. I just found you." But Heather only smiled faintly, and for a moment it felt as though the world had narrowed to the space between them. The quiet garden, the smell of lavender and salt carried on the breeze, the warmth of sunlight stitching together two lives that had collided by chance. From then on, Petra visited every day. She brought books, fruit, little pastries from her favorite bakery in town. They talked for hours about everything and nothing, about the law and the sea, about childhood dreams, about songs they both remembered from years past. Heather laughed more now, though sometimes Petra caught shadows crossing her face when she thought no one noticed. The bond between them deepened in ways neither could name. It was not just friendship, not yet sisterhood, something more fluid, more mysterious. Petra found herself thinking about Heather at night, replaying her words, her expressions. She had never felt so tethered to another person so quickly. When Heather was finally discharged, she had nowhere to go. The hospital staff asked if she had friends, relatives, anyone to stay with. She shook her head. Petra didn't hesitate. "She can stay with me," she said, the decision spilling out before she could question it. Her parents were surprised, but did not object. They had always taught Petra kindness, and though they seemed wary of Heather's haunted silences, they opened their home. Heather settled into the small guest room, her presence soft but steady, like a candle that refused to be extinguished. Days turned into weeks. Petra found herself hurrying home from lectures, eager to share her day. They cooked together, laughed over spilled flour, walked along the beach in the evenings. Sometimes they fell into deep conversations that stretched until dawn, secrets unraveling like threads between them. It was during one of those late nights, when the house was quiet and the air heavy with the scent of jasmine from the garden, that Heather spoke words that froze Petra's blood. "I feel like I know you," Heather whispered. Her voice was low, almost fragile, as though she were confessing something she barely dared believe. "Like I've always known you." Petra's breath caught. "I feel the same," she admitted, before she could stop herself. They sat in silence for a long time, their gazes locked, the weight of something unspoken hanging thick in the air. Love, yes, but not the kind Petra had known before. This was deeper, stranger, bound by threads she couldn't name. Weeks became months. Their closeness grew undeniable, their laughter carrying through the house, their comfort with each other as natural as breathing. And yet, beneath the warmth of their bond, Petra's old question lingered, her mother's evasive silence, the shadow of secrets she could not shake. It was a simple thing that unraveled it. One afternoon, Heather reached for a book on the shelf, and a photo slipped from its pages. A family picture. Petra as a small child between her parents, smiling shyly at the camera. Heather bent to pick it up. She froze as she stared at the photograph. Her hands trembled, her face drained of color. Petra, alarmed, hurried to her side. "What is it?" Heather turned the photo slowly, her voice shaking. "This, your mother. I know her." Petra blinked. "What do you mean?" Heather swallowed hard, her eyes glistening with something raw, painful. "Because she's my mother, too." The room seemed to tilt. Petra's breath fled her lungs, replaced by a ringing silence. For a heartbeat she thought Heather was mistaken, delirious. But the certainty in her voice, the anguish etched into her face, struck like lightning. Her mother. Their mother. The truth rose like a tide, sweeping everything away. The silence in the room was unbearable. Petra could hear her own pulse hammering in her ears, loud, relentless, impossible to ignore. Heather still held the photograph in her trembling hand, her eyes shining with disbelief and grief. Petra shook her head slowly, as if that alone could erase the words she had just heard. No, no, that's not possible. You must be mistaken. Heather lifted her gaze, and in it was something Petra had never seen before, a terrible certainty. I'm not mistaken. I know her face. I have carried it with me all my life, in the faintest fragments of memory. When I was small, before I was taken away, she held me. That woman is our mother. The words slammed into Petra's chest like waves breaking against rock. She stumbled back, collapsing into the chair as if her legs could no longer bear her weight. No, she whispered again, but her voice cracked, betraying her fear. Memories crashed over her mother's silence whenever Petra asked about her birth, the evasive smiles, the way her parents had always seemed. Older, wearier, more careful. The unanswered questions, the shadow in her mother's eyes when she'd asked, "How old were you when you had me?" Petra pressed her hands to her face, trying to hold herself together. Heather crossed the room slowly, as though afraid her steps might shatter the fragile ground beneath them both. She knelt before Petra, her voice breaking. I didn't want to believe it either. I've spent years wondering who I was, where I came from. And then I saw that photo. Her voice faltered. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I think she couldn't keep us both. I think she gave me away. The words cut like glass. Petra lowered her hands, staring into Heather's tear-streaked face. No, my mother would never. But even as she said it, the doubt clawed at her chest. Her mother's hesitations, the way she'd never answered. Had the truth always been there, hidden behind silence? Petra felt as though the ground beneath her had split open, revealing a chasm she hadn't known existed. She reached out instinctively, gripping Heather's hands tightly, as though clinging to the only solid thing left. If this is true, Petra whispered, her throat tight, then you're not just someone I found on the beach. You're my sister. Heather's lips trembled, and she nodded once, fiercely, as though the word itself gave her strength. Yes. The room fell quiet again, but it was no longer empty silence. It was heavy, charged, filled with the gravity of what they had just uncovered. That night, Petra lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. She heard every creak of the house, every faint rustle of the wind outside. Sleep was impossible. Her mind replayed Heather's words, the photograph, her mother's evasive silence. Questions burned like fire. Why didn't she tell me? Why would she keep Heather a secret? How could she give her own child away? By morning, Petra's decision was made. At the breakfast table, she set down her cup with a sharp clink. Her mother looked up from buttering her toast, her eyes flickering briefly toward Heather, who sat quietly across from Petra. "Mum," Petra began, her voice steady but cold, "I need you to tell me the truth. About my birth. About Heather." The knife slipped slightly in her mother's hand, butter smearing unevenly across the bread. For a long moment she didn't move, her back rigid. Then she set the knife down carefully, too carefully, as though her world depended on the steadiness of her hands. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice forced into calmness. Petra's heart pounded, but she pressed on. "She's my sister, isn't she? You gave her away." The words hung in the air like thunder. Her father froze mid-sip of coffee, his eyes darting between them. Heather sat still, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Her mother closed her eyes. When she opened them again, there was no denial left. Only pain. "Yes," she whispered. The room seemed to shrink around Petra, the walls pressing closer. She wanted to scream, to demand how her mother could have kept such a secret, but the sight of tears brimming in her mother's eyes stopped her. "I was young," her mother began, her voice breaking. You have only ever known me as older, steady, careful. But before your father, I was just a frightened girl. Poor, alone. I had no one. When I had Heather, I had nothing. No home, no support, only shame. People whispered. They judged. I could barely feed myself. I thought, if I gave her to another family, maybe she would have a better life. Her words tumbled out in ragged breaths, each one cutting into Petra's chest. When I met your father years later, I never told him everything. And when I had you, Petra, her voice cracked, tears spilling down her face. I wanted to believe I could keep you safe from that pain, that I could bury the past. But the past has a way of finding us. Silence fell again, heavier than before. Heather's shoulders shook with quiet sobs. Petra stared at her mother, torn between fury and heartbreak. You lied to me my whole life, Petra whispered. Her mother shook her head, trembling. I didn't lie. I just couldn't bear to tell you. I thought I was protecting you, protecting myself. But you were right to ask, and I should have told you. Petra rose abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the floor. She couldn't breathe in that room, couldn't bear the suffocating weight of all that had been hidden. She fled out the door, the cool morning air striking her face as she stumbled toward the beach. Heather followed, calling her name, but Petra kept walking until the sea was before her, endless and untamed. She stood at the water's edge, tears streaming down her face, her fists clenched. Heather reached her at last, breathless, her voice hoarse. Petra, please. Petra turned on her, anguish spilling out in broken words. All this time, all my questions, and she just let me believe. She let you suffer alone. Heather's eyes glistened as she shook her head. She made mistakes, terrible ones, but she's still our mother. Petra's chest heaved with sobs. I don't know if I can forgive her. Heather stepped closer, her hand trembling as she reached for Petra's. Maybe forgiveness will come later. But right now, we have each other. That's what matters. Petra looked at her sister, truly looked, at the pain and resilience in her eyes, at the bond that had formed between them before they even knew they were bound by blood. Slowly, she let Heather's hand fold around hers. In that moment, something shifted. The betrayal, the sorrow, the confusion. They were still there, raw and sharp. But beneath them was something stronger, a thread that tied them together, invisible yet unbreakable. Love. The weeks that followed were not easy. Petra confronted her mother again and again, demanding answers, railing against the silence of years. Sometimes their arguments ended in tears, sometimes in slammed doors. But Heather was always there, the quiet anchor beside her, the sister she had never known she needed. They learned each other's scars, shared each other's laughter, carried each other's burdens. Heather told Petra of the years she barely remembered, the cold foster homes, the hunger, the loneliness. Petra listened, her heart aching with guilt for the life she had lived, safe and loved, while Heather had endured so much. But Heather never let bitterness take root. We found each other, she would say softly when Petra's guilt threatened to consume her. That's what matters now. Seasons changed. The salty breeze grew cooler, autumn leaves scattering across Rijeka's streets. Petra and Heather walked those streets together, their voices rising in laughter that once had belonged to strangers, but now belonged to sisters. Their bond was not perfect. There were days when Petra's anger at their mother resurfaced, when Heather's sadness shadowed her smile. But through it all, love wove them together. A love that was fierce, sometimes painful, sometimes joyous, always unbreakable. On the anniversary of the night Petra had found her, they returned to the beach. The tide whispered across the sand, the moon casting silver light across the waves. They stood side by side, the ocean stretching vast before them. "You saved me," Heather said again, her voice steady this time. Petra shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "No, we saved each other." Heather turned to her, eyes shining. "Promise me, no matter what happens, no secrets, no silence, just truth, just love." Petra squeezed her hand firmly. "I promise." The waves rolled in, covering their feet in cool foam, retreating again as if bowing to the bond they had forged. The city lights of Rijeka glimmered behind them, but in that moment, the world was only the two of them, sisters bound not just by blood, but by fate, by choice, by love, eternal. Love, Petra realized, was not always neat. It was sometimes brutal, sometimes tender, sometimes hidden behind years of silence. But it was the one thing that endured. Love did not break, even when truth did. Love did not falter, even when trust wavered. And in the arms of her sister, Petra knew she had found the one truth that would carry her all her life. That love in all its forms was unshakable, unbreakable, eternal,